and it is a great pleasure for me to invite Jane Francis. I've known Jane for many years because we just a few metro stations apart in Montreal, and Jane Francis, who holds her master's and PhD from a Brian Meyer College in classical archaeology. She's been teaching in the classics program at Concordia University since 1995, and she's specialized in Greek and Roman pottery in Crete, and especially on the fabric analysis and ancient beekeeping. And she's very active, of course, in Greece and in Crete, but she's also very active in Montreal, and she worked also in Turkey. She worked in Turkey, but in Crete she did a lot of surveys, excavations on Crete, Monio di Gitria, Scotino Cave, independent ceramic studies. She's currently co-author of the final publication of the Sfakia survey project. And once again, so you're extremely involved also in Canada. I could give you the best example is that she's been on the board of directors of the Canadian Institute. Can I say 30 years? Can I say it? 30 years. Come on. And so, I'm very happy to have you here, Jane, this evening. And the floor is yours. Beekeeping in Ancient Crete, Evidence and Interpretation. Jonathan? Yes, if you have to close that one, probably. And then, there it is.
How do I make it?
You make it there, down there.
Where's the cursor? I'm cursing the cursor.
You're looking for the cursor. Here's a cursor. Here it is. Here's a cursor. And so here's the. How do you make that big? Big screen. No? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Whoops. Here. Okay. Whoops. Sorry. Are we okay?
Yes. Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I am extremely pleased to be here. I last lectured at SIG several buildings ago, I believe. I would first like to thank Jacques and Jonathan for not only asking me to present tonight, but also for making all of this possible. Uh-oh. Okay. The bee, one of the smallest but mightiest of creatures. Crucially important to our biosphere today, and no less significant in antiquity, bees and their activities were a source of constant fascination for the Greeks and Romans, as also for many other cultures throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. As is widely known, the bee supplied honey, the only natural and accessible sweetener for many millennia. Bees also produced wax, which was used for many purposes in daily life and also artistic pursuits. For example, both commodities were used in ancient rituals, from providing ingredients for honey cakes offered to deities to furnishing illumination with candles. Honey was employed at funerals, and in the Aeneid, it is used to subdue Cerberus. Wax imagenes circulated during Roman funerary processions. In mythology, bees are associated with the birth of Zeus through Melissa, the nymph who tended the infant god. In literature, bees have stood as a metaphor for the ideal society and also provided inspiration to poets and writers. According to Cicero, bees are responsible for the eloquence of Plato. When an infant, bees settled on his lips, and this was interpreted to mean that he would have a rare sweetness of speech. Until the early 1970s, the literary record was the sole means of reconstructing ancient apiculture. Scholars interested in the actual mechanics of beekeeping had to rely entirely upon the references and discussions in writers like Aristotle, Varro, Pliny, and Columella. This relatively limited corpus of evidence was supplemented with the 1973 publication of ceramic beekeeping equipment from the Varri House excavations in Attica, which confirmed a series of large tubular vessels with interior scoring as beehives. And since then, similar containers and their related apparatus have been identified at many sites across Greece and the island, from both survey and excavated contexts, as well as in pre-Roman Spain, Roman Dalmatia, and several sites in Asia Minor. These objects are remarkably recognizable because of their interior surface treatment, and their presence at a site thus allows for expanded interpretations of landscape use and agricultural practices in antiquity. The ceramic equipment from Varri, and now at many, many other sites across Greece, is generally represented by a suite of 3 pieces that can be used in various combinations. The earliest, best dated examples come from Attica in the late 5th century BCE, although earlier literary documents attest to beekeeping with manufactured hives, although we have no idea whether these were also made of terracotta. For example, Hesiod refers to bees in covered or roofed beehives in the Theogony, and organized apiculture must have been practiced in Attica by the early 6th century BCE, when Solon passed laws about the spacing of hives in the landscape. The most numerous finds of beehives in ceramic are a type designed to be laid horizontally. These take the form of long tubes made in different shapes and sizes, possibly dependent on date and region. These containers are then bolstered by rocks, trees, or walls, with an open end facing outwards. Some hives have solid, rounded, or flat bases or floors, with the other end left open. Others display 2 open ends. Some are cannon-like, with a consistent diameter, while others have bodies flaring to a wider open rim. Morphologically, these are fairly simple containers. Scored grooves cover at least part of the interior wall, and this is a feature thought to have provided the bees with a roughened surface for the attachment of their honeycombs, which would thus have been placed upwards. So the scored part is the upper interior surface. The second piece of equipment is an open-ended sleeve, generally called an extension ring, also with a scored interior surface. These rings can be of incredibly varied lengths, including some very short examples of only about 4.5 centimeters. One of the longest, at about 30 centimeters, comes from Thorikos. These were attached to the open mouth of the hives, whose rims have similar diameters, and they are thought to have been used to extend the length and interior area of the hives, and thus the number of honeycombs within. This would naturally lead to a greater abundance of honey and wax. More honeycombs, more honey. These rings, as in the example, the reconstruction from Eleftheria in Crete, could also be stacked in multiple examples, ring upon ring, depending on the desired length by the beekeeper. The last part of the configuration, or the suite of beekeeping equipment, is some kind of a lid. These are not as well preserved as the hives and the rings, and many parts of Greece seems to have closed beehives with perishable materials, perhaps of wood or bark. Ceramic lids, which are very common in Attica, consist of a flat disc with ridges on the top surface and holes. And these seem to have been used, as in the reconstructions, to tie the lid, the rim, to the final extension ring or to the mouth of the hives. This was achieved with sticks employed as handles and probably rope. In general, the setup, the organization of these hives in the landscape with these three components must be established to provide some pretty basic requirements. The hives must ensure an environment for the bees that is safe from predators and also from bad weather. It must be appropriate and provide encouragement for the construction of honeycombs, and it must provide a secure environment for the propagation of the swarm. One other type of ceramic hive was also manufactured, but this seems to have been, at least in antiquity, it seems to have had a fairly limited regional use. This is a vat-shaped hive positioned vertically on the ground with a flat base, flaring short walls, and a flight hole bored through the lower wall. These come predominantly from Izmia and date to the Hellenistic period. The most famous example is the so-called Orostada beehive with the name engraved on it. These resemble much later modern Vraskos or Vraski hives that were used throughout Greece, although it is an important point that the later examples do not contain the interior scored surfaces. The Hellenistic examples from Izmia, as you can see, do contain this feature. The presence of ceramic beekeeping equipment in assemblages has enabled fieldwork projects across Greece to add beekeeping to lists of rural and some urban activities of the past. But the interpretation of this evidence is more nuanced than simply the recognition of yet another agricultural pursuit. An understanding of ancient apiculture in Greece is, in fact, riddled with questions involving many different aspects of our understanding of this type of ceramic vessel, such as the role of foreign influence in the development of Greek apiculture, and also, do we need to reassess the literary evidence upon so much of our interpretations have long stood? For the rest of this paper this evening, I would like to explore some of these issues connected with reconstructions of ancient beekeeping, and thus, hopefully, to position this field of study more accurately for future research. Question 1. When did beekeeping with manufactured hives, or apiculture, begin in Greece? The date for the earliest human interventions into bees for the purpose of acquiring their honey, wax, and even propolis is unknown, but almost certainly involved wild honey hunting rather than any systematic organized apiculture. Mesolithic rock paintings from sites in Europe, Asia, and Africa depict bees and wild nests, sometimes alongside humans identified as honey hunters. A rock painting from Bicorp near Valencia in Spain, for example, clearly depicts what must have been a common practice, a honey hunter reaching into the bees' nests to reach the goodies inside. The hazards of this practice, as well as its imprecise guarantee of success, must have frustrated early hunters and consumers of bee products, and yet they persisted. The point at which humans realized that they could harness bees and thus exert a measure of control over the amounts of honey and wax produced and the location and number of hives is not clearly known. Nor can the material or the configuration of the first hives be recovered with certainty, at least for Greece. At present, the earliest claimed beehives are Middle to late Neolithic, although this function is by no means certain. The remains are few and constitute only a few fragments of perforated ceramic vessels from, for example, Thasos and Macedonia that have tested positive through residue analysis for the presence of beeswax. The evaporative properties of honey mean that it does not preserve well enough for detection, even with modern testing. Whether this trace of beeswax is sufficient evidence to identify a container as a beehive is debatable. The results confirm only that wax was contained within these receptacles, and it testifies to human use of beekeeping products at this early date. What we still do not know is how these products were acquired and whether organized beekeeping with manufactured hives was involved. Perforated vessels also do not seem optimal for bees, as while they would provide ventilation, they would allow access to predators. Beekeeping has also been claimed for the prehistoric cultures of Greece, particularly for Minoan Crete. It is clear that honey, and to a lesser extent wax, played important roles in Aegean culture. Linear bead tablets contain many references to honey, which was the second most common commodity offered to the gods at Knossos, after olive oil. While honey can be obtained from wild honey hunting, beekeeping with hives is a much better way to guarantee sufficient amounts and a consistent supply. Images of bees and even beehives have been identified on many Minoan artifacts, and while many of these are, in my opinion, too impressionistic for secure identification, one can obviously not ignore, the imagery and the importance of bees in artifacts like the Malia bee pendant of about 1800 BC. The emphasis on bees and the required amounts of honey for the Minoans have led to the identification of a specific ceramic shape as a prehistoric beehive. This is a tub-shaped vessel with a flat base, flaring walls, sometimes with lug handles, and positioned vertically. The interior walls display grooves, often in large diagonal crosshatched patterns. These grooves can be wide, about the width of a human finger, or narrower, more like scratches. The floors of these vessels also bear similar decoration, sometimes as repeated divots or as spiral grooves. These were produced from the Middle Minoan II through Late Minoan Ib periods and have appeared at many sites across Crete with a remarkable consistency. It is clear, however, that the interpretation of these Minoan vessels as beehives has been heavily influenced by the appearance of classical and later hives, especially the vertical examples from Izmia. In both cases, the flat base of the container suggests a vertical positioning, and these have been reconstructed as an early version of the top bar hive. Sticks or slats are placed across the open mouth, and the whole thing covered with some type of vegetal matter for insulation, and then covered with a lid. These slats support the honeycombs, which hang down into the container, and the bars, and this is not complicated technology. The problem is that there is no evidence for such hives in antiquity, let alone in prehistoric Crete. And in fact, the first verifiable reference to such hives appears only in George Wheeler's account of his travels in Greece, which was published in 1682. Experimental reconstructions with replicas of this type of container and bars set across the open mouth have demonstrated that bees will use these as beehives and attach honeycombs to the slats. However, these results do not confirm that this hive technology existed in the prehistoric Aegean. Instead, it just proves that bees will use such containers given the opportunity. An important aspect of the interpretation of these containers is their interior scoring. Scoring is thought to have been developed in imitation of an observed location where bees frequently built their nests in nature, a hollow log, with the natural striations of the wood replicated by the grooves. Scoring on the sides and bottom of a top bar hive is unnecessary, especially if it was developed to encourage the adhesion of honeycombs, as the bees will attach combs to the slats over the mouth. Depending on the size of the swarm, the combs may reach the side walls of the vessels, or even the bottoms, in which case the grooves could be used to support them, but such arrangements are not attested. Later post-antique and modern ceramic hives made in this shape and used as top bar hives have smooth interior walls, and they lack any grooves or scoring, and that this is apparently a feature that is not necessary for hive function with this shape. The grooves on the wall make more sense if these Minoan vessels were set horizontally on their sides, as has been proposed. But while this arrangement would facilitate the attachment of honeycombs to the scored interior walls, which would now lie on top, the treatment of the floor surface then makes no sense. Another interpretation suggests positioning the hives upside down with their open mouths against the ground. This arrangement would make a good use of the floor treatment, but not so much of the wall scoring. To date, then, the use of these widespread Minoan vessels as beehives has not been proven, nor can we accurately reconstruct their use. But it is encouraging that other interpretations are now being put forth. One such vessel, right there, which I came upon last week, in the Heraklion Museum is now identified not as a beehive, but as a wine collector. And it does have interior scoring. In any event, the connection of these vessels with beekeeping would be considerably strengthened by residue analysis, which might show the presence of wax on their interiors. But this has so far not been done. The case for manufactured beehives in Minoan Crete can, however, be examined in the context of evidence for apiculture from ancient Egypt. A small corpus of tomb paintings and reliefs depict apiaries in great detail. These show beekeepers at work at apiaries with beehives depicted as long tombs, there and there. These are stacked in multiple levels with the open ends facing the workers. Those tending the bees approach the mouths and are shown variously extracting honeycombs, smoking the bees to make them more docile, and dripping honey from combs into other containers. Bees are frequently depicted flying around these apiaries. The precision with which artists represented the apiaries, the different containers, the personnel, and the processes indicates a very detailed understanding of bee behavior and beekeeping in ancient Egypt. These images, which date from the 5th Egyptian dynasty in the mid-3rd millennium down to the 6th century BCE, also depict the same beehive type with remarkable consistency. Given this ample data, it is surprising that no actual beehives are preserved from Egypt, a lacuna that leads to the assumption that these hives that are depicted in the artistic images were in real life made of unfired clay and thus do not survive. This proposition is supported by the discovery of an apiary of tubular hives at Tel Rehov in the Jordan Valley in 2007. The structure that houses this apiary dates to the 10th century BCE. These beehives were made out of unfired clay mixed with straw and animal dung, with walls about 4 centimeters thick. 2 years later, excavation in the same area revealed an additional 17 hives. The dimensions of these containers are similar, about 80 centimeters in length, with a diameter of about 40 centimeters. Each hive has a solid base or floor pierced in the center with a rounded hole for bee access, while the other end was closed with a thick disc of clay as a lid, again unfired. Several of these vessels also preserve handles. Samples subjected to gas chromatography indicated beehives in the walls of the containers, as well as remains of burnt honeycombs and many other body parts of honeybees. These hives were not fired as part of their manufacture, but inadvertently due to the site's destruction by fire, and they thus represent a rare occurrence. It is, however, possible to see in this apiary not only the physical manifestation of the Egyptian beehive types illustrated so well in their art, but also, quite likely in my view, of a Minoan variety, which perhaps of unfired clay does not preserve in any examples. Issue 2. Should we believe ancient writers? The discovery of ceramic beehives in the archaeological record has proven an opportunity to evaluate the ancient literary descriptions of beehives and assess their accuracy. It is largely in Roman authors that we have the most detailed discussion about the mechanics of beekeeping, which include comments on beehives of various types. Before I go any farther, I would like to make 2 points. First, it is very unlikely that any of these writers had practical beekeeping experience, except perhaps for Virgil. And second, most of these authors were looking at beekeeping from where they lived, namely Italy, and their familiarity with apiculture in a practical sense was limited to this region and also prior texts that they seem to have relied on extensively for information. There are cases for plagiarism that you would not believe. Anyway, these authors are also fairly consistent in their assessment of beehives, not surprisingly. They say that beehives should be lightweight, portable, and durable. They should provide ventilation for the bees and also good temperature control. They therefore extol the virtues of bark, which was removed from the tree in a large sleeve and formed into a long cylinder. They praise ferula, or fennel stalks, as well as malleable twigs like withy, willow, and osier, which must have been woven together much like later post-antique skeps hives. Beehives made from wooden boards are endorsed, and these may have resembled modern wooden hives. The use of logs as beehives is also cited. More unusual materials also feature in ancient authors' assessments of beehives: mud, animal dung, bricks, and a translucent stone that may well be mica. Where, might one ask, are the ceramic hives that occur so frequently across Greece? They are present but soundly condemned in 100% of ancient texts. One reason seems to be their lack of temperature control. It is said that these hives are too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. This is noted by Varro, Columella, and Palladius. This complaint seems to be supported by the lack of ceramic hives from Italy, and it may be that this was simply a widespread belief in the region. They didn't use them because they had these negative properties. On the other hand, these authors are simply incorrect. Bees have the ability to control the temperature inside their hives, regardless of its material. In the winter, they can cluster together to conserve heat, or cool the temperature by beating their wings in the summer, which produces a fanning effect. They do this anyway to help evaporate the water in the honey. Another complaint by ancient authors was that ceramic hives were not portable, and admittedly, they do seem to be awkward and breakable containers. On the other hand, at least in Greece, thick-walled ceramic containers, even larger than beehives, were regularly transported around the landscapes, for example, pithoi. And all Mediterranean regions moved full transport amphorae. So moving beehives around, if required, does not seem to have been an insurmountable difficulty. The criticisms by ancient authors thus seem to stem more from an unfamiliarity with ceramic hives, which do not seem to have been used in Italy, and in fact, no securely identified examples have been found. Columella, however, as a Spaniard, should have been familiar with this type of beekeeping in his native land. And in the middle of the slide is a nice assemblage of some examples of terracotta hives from pre-Roman Spain that were probably still out in use in the landscape in Columella's time. Issue number 3, what do we know about the manufacture of ceramic beehives? Ceramic beehives may have been a specialty product, but their manufacture is very much tied to their use. The first step for any prospective ancient beekeeper is obviously to acquire hives. Ceramic hives were produced by potters, but the production of this specific shape may have also entailed collaboration with the beekeeper. It is assumed that beekeepers may not have been potters, and vice versa, but we're not sure about that. But beekeepers, at least some of them, may not have had any detailed knowledge about the specifics of the shape and its necessary features. First, the diameter of the container would have been important for the ability of the bees to construct their combs. Second, the length of the hives is related to the treatment of one end. A hive with a solid closed end cannot be much larger than the length of a man's arm, namely the potter's, as he must be able to reach into the hive to execute the scoring on the interior surface before the vessel is fired. Hives with both ends open can be longer because the potter can reach in from either end. The scoring, too, may have required consultation, as this is not a feature normally produced in by a potter. He may have really queried why he was being asked to do this. The variation in patterns across Greek examples is considerable, from the very neat cross-hatched grooves of Attica, which display the use of a multi-toothed comb, to the very haphazard individual scratches of Cretan hives. And it suggests that the instructions given to potters was simply make some grooves over a certain percentage of the interior surface. But the extent of scoring, in other words, how much of the interior surface was scored, and what seems to be regional preferences in patterns and even tools may have had to be conveyed to the potter. These requirements thus indicate a rare instance of industrial collaboration, where the person who makes the object probably had no first-hand information or experience about how the product was going to be used. On the other hand, there seems to have been some overlap between the manufacture of beehives and transport amphorae, with which potters would have been much more familiar. Fabric analyses have demonstrated the use of same or very similar clays for both shapes, and indeed the two vessel types have similar requirements: durability, fairly thick walls, and a large interior capacity. Further study is needed on this connection, but potters making amphorae may also have been those who produced beehives, as their knowledge would have given them something of an edge in manufacture. Also connected with manufacture is the extension ring, which is found in profusion across Greece, often alongside hives. These rings are thought to have been attached to the open mouth of the hives to extend the length and therefore capacity, but they are completely absent from any written accounts of beekeeping. It is possible that they were not used in Italy in any material at all, and thus have escaped the notice of our Roman beekeeping authorities. The rings are made in various lengths, as I said, from about 4.5 to 30 centimeters, and no regional preferences in size or configuration has so far been noted. They are thick-walled of about 1 centimeter, and they preserve very well. It is not uncommon, even on survey, to find complete profiles. They also show interior scoring. The precise use of these rings is unclear. Extensions to the hives make sense if they are added to closed-end hives, which are shorter. But these are also found alongside fragments of open-ended hives, where they could presumably, as in the example here, be added to both ends. These rings had additional advantages. They could have enabled the beekeeper to remove small sections of honeycombs at a time in the manner of modern wooden Langstroth hives, and we've all seen photos of the beekeeper pulling out the honeycombs. This method of extraction is less intrusive to the swarm inside. The rings could be removed one by one, the honeycombs cut out, and the rings put back in place without disturbing the main swarm. This would also allow beekeepers to harvest the honey without abundant smoking, which in antiquity was said to produce a higher quality honey. The use of the rings would also facilitate easier cleaning and fumigation of the hives, which was particularly important after the winter when the hives were set up again for the next season. This is all well and good, but how were these rings affixed to the hives? Beehive rings are frequently outcurved or thickened, but sometimes display a rounded top surface. In contrast, the extension ring rims are usually horizontal, beveled, or oblique. On occasion, they seem to have been made to fit together with a nice tight and close seal, one on top of the other. And in most cases, though, it is not easy to assign a preserved ring to the rim of a preserved hive, and the rim shapes of each do not immediately suggest that they go together. This is particularly the case with rings showing beveled or sloping hives and rims and hives with rounded rims. Such a tight fit, however, may not have been required, especially once the hives were in place in the apiary. The rings could simply be leaned against the mouth or even tied on with ropes, utilizing the projecting rim of the hive. Beekeepers could also use honey or propolis as an adhesive for a temporary fit until the bees began their work. Another way in which the rings could be affixed is through the location of the hives, as seems to have been the case at Eleftherna in Crete, reconstructed here. The hives were sheltered in a rock-built frame that would have kept all the pieces together on the sides. Other more ad hoc arrangements might have also secured the rings, such as leaning rocks against the hive closure or building the apiary into a wall. This is a big one. Why do bees not develop morphologically? Singular to beekeeping equipment, among all other classes of ancient ceramic vessels, is a noteworthy lack of morphological development. The parts of a beehive that could exhibit chronologically developed detectable changes are actually quite limited: the rims, the length, and the configuration of the end. Regional preferences can sometimes be identified, some of which are tied to particular periods or locations. For example, the vat-type hives at Isthmia is a Hellenistic development. An odd-footed beehive in the center appears in Crete in the 2nd century CE, and late antique Crete produced a bell-shaped version with a flat button at its base. The earliest forms from the late 5th century BCE already show a variety of contemporary rim forms. Centuries later, these have not necessarily much altered. Extension rings also maintain their rim forms over very long periods. For example, here we see an attic hive from Thamari here that may be classical, but it may be late antique. Let's see, where are we here? From West Crete, the Sfakia survey, Hellenistic or Roman. And from Knossos, late Roman, 5th century CE. And this shows generally the same approach to just a thickened rim. Susan Rotroff, I'm very pleased to see sitting here, has described the pace of beehive morphological evolution as glacial, which is, I love that. But the rim forms also seem to be more random, and I think this is emphasized the more examples that we find. And in a way, this lack of consistency and development is understandable. A beehive is fundamentally an industrial object. It must be able to shelter the bees, provide ample space for the construction of honeycombs, and facilitate the harvesting of honey and wax by the beekeeper. Such containers, which would have been used by a fairly small amount of the population, do not need to respond to trends. They also exhibit no decoration of any significance, and they seem to be immune from foreign influences. The rim, for instance, only needs some thickening or overhang for the attachment of ropes or for tying on a lid or an extension rim. But the precise form of that rim does not really matter. It will still work. The consequence of this variety and lack of change means that beekeeping equipment is extremely difficult to date unless it comes from a stratified context. As surface finds, they cannot be dated on their own. Associated pottery can help, especially if the shapes are those typically used in beekeeping, such as jugs, hydriae, amphorae, or large basins, craters, or vats, which are frequently used for bringing and delivering water to the bees. There are tubs for catching dripping honey, strainers and funnels for processing honey and wax, and for decanting these commodities. My concluding remarks to this paper concern not only how we should be analyzing and interpreting ancient beekeeping equipment when it was found in fieldwork, but also how the questions I have posed can enhance our understanding of this important agricultural activity. First, it would be helpful to include more beehives in published pottery catalogs and to consider them alongside discussions of other ceramics. Information about their manufacture, the details of their scoring, their shapes, and fabrics can link these containers with better known vessels and may provide some connections. Fabric analysis in particular may identify particular clay types used for beehives that were also used for other vessels that are better dated. Such research may also indicate the sources of the beehives and answer questions about trade, not only in beekeeping commodities, but also about the beehives themselves, about which very little has been stated. A greater emphasis on beehives in publication might also reveal information about their morphological development, or at least allow them to be assessed regionally. It might be that simply too few examples have been published and we're missing nuances of change. With a more thorough study of more examples, it may be possible to detect not only regional preferences, but also interregional influences and trade. The patterns of scoring and methods of their execution also warrant additional attention, especially as this has for many decades been a major identifying factor for beehive equipment. However, it is clear that only a part of the interior surface of most beehives is scored. And where are all the rest? It is certain that many fragments of the unscored parts have not been properly identified. In other words, we need a better dossier of beehive morphological features and shapes that will allow us to produce a more holistic identification. Third, the issue of prehistoric beekeeping with ceramic hives must be clarified through residue analysis. That the Heraklion Museum is already moving away from the automatic assumption of scored vats as beehives is certainly a step in the right direction. But the assumption that all such containers are beehives is misguided, in my view. We must also take caution in the use of ancient texts for our understanding of ancient beekeeping. Many things these authors wrote are certainly correct, but not all, as their rejection of ceramic hives demonstrates. They were not beekeepers, and their knowledge of bee biology, activities, and the practice of apiculture does seem to be regionally limited. The reliance of these authors on early authorities, many of whose texts are lost, also means that these misconceptions have become embedded in the literature and thus in some modern interpretations. Finally, we should be thinking about how we can use data about ancient beekeeping in future research. More information about climate change in the Greek and Roman Mediterranean is now available, and it should be possible to correlate this to beekeeping practices and the location through finds of beekeeping equipment. This would be particularly useful through survey projects. Do beekeepers need to change the location of their apiaries because of temperature and environmental changes? We should consider beekeeping in light of historical botany to understand how landscapes that supported bees may have developed over time. Faunal analysis may reveal an increase in dental issues in skeletal remains, and it is possible that this may be correlated to the rise of beekeeping at a site and the emergence of an increased consumption of honey. And in fact, this has been done for at least one location in Greece. In short, the bee is our friend. We all know this. But the bee can also be our archaeological ally. Thank you.